Good afternoon, and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. My name is Greg Erie, and I serve as the ADL's Vice President for Law Enforcement and Analysis. Today, joining me for the panel Behind the Scenes, Monitoring, Exposing, and Disrupting Extremism, are the Center on Extremism's Associate Director, Joanna Mendelson, and our Senior Investigative Researcher, Chris M. A bit about the COE. It's comprised of experts and investigators, analysts and researchers who strategically monitor, expose, and disrupt extremist threats online and on the ground. Currently, today, the COE is the foremost authority on extremism, terrorism, and hate, both foreign and domestic. The COE provides resources, expertise, and trainings that enable our law enforcement partners, public officials, and community leaders, as well as internet and technology companies, to identify and counter emerging threats. This session will explore how actionable intelligence information developed by our team has helped thwart potential extremist attacks against Jews and other vulnerable communities. A little bit about myself. Before coming to the ADL about 6 months ago, I was a senior executive with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where I worked for over 22 years. And I'm proud to be a member of a new team. The ADL's reputation amongst law enforcement is that of a professional group and a partner. And when I use the word partner, it's a very important word to use today in this time. Partnership means through good and bad, you work together for the community good, to keep people safe. And it doesn't mean you always support your partner blindly. It means you support them through thick and thin. That is the relationship we have had with law enforcement throughout the years. One relationship that I always like to highlight when people think this is new is that the ADL has had a formal relationship with the FBI dating back to 1968, another very tumultuous time in our country. And we're going through another one today. What we are going to talk about is how we deal with our law enforcement partners and help them and assist them in finding that extremist threat, what's often called the needle amongst a haystack of needles. That's our expertise, and that's what we bring to the fight.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joanna Mendelson. I'm the Associate Director for the Center on Extremism, and it is my pleasure today to join you along with my colleague, Chris M., to explore the behind-the-scenes monitoring, exposing, and disrupting extremism. You should know that today, the landscape of hate is a vibrant one, unfortunately, in our country. This year alone, we have seen so much. And so our team, our mighty team of experts across the country, are looking to explore both open source and confidential source information in order to piece together the puzzle and to flag extremist events, incidents, individuals, and criminality. The goal is ultimately to be left of bang. Right? If bang is ultimately the moment in time where disaster strikes in our nation, where our sense of security and safety is obliterated, we hope, as part of the Center on Extremism, to be there to disrupt that event, to disrupt the incident before it occurs. And that is what we work tirelessly to do in order to track, to monitor, and to expose. So as the leading anti-hate organization founded in 1913, in response to escalating climate of anti-Semitism and bigotry, our mission has never more been as important as it is today. Our goal is to monitor with the same vigor and passion, to expose extremism and fight hate online and the real world. And so in this presentation today, you're going to see a behind the scenes of what we are doing in order to protect our nation. But first, I want to give you a little bit of landscape setting and to identify some of that work. The Center on Extremism is essentially made up of a number of experts, actually a combined total of 150 years of experience in this arena, where we routinely assist law enforcement with extremist-related investigations, help tech companies respond to critical data, and provide our expertise to a wide-ranging media, to media outlets. Let's take a look at some of the numbers. It was a busy year last year, and I would say that we have far exceeded the numbers from last year compared to today. Last year alone, we published 45 blogs and authored 9 major reports. We mapped 11,000 data points, whether documenting white supremacist activity or extremist-related violence or anti-Semitic incidents. And we trained 5,000 law enforcement in over 60 trainings. But even in spite of COVID in 2020, our numbers will far exceed 2019. We published 71 blogs this year alone, 16 backgrounders, and 8 major reports. We mapped 17,000 data sets with months remaining in the year, and we've already exceeded the number of law enforcement trained. The Center on Extremism continues to be vibrant in tracking and monitoring extremism and helping to educate, a very critical part of our work. One of the things that we see related to what's so significant is our need to identify what is taking place on the ground with hard stats. So anecdotally, we can all feel that the landscape of hate has risen, that vitriol and bigotry, racism, xenophobia feels like it's at somewhat of an all-time high. And yet we need data sets to help measure and help to track and document that sentiment, to provide hard-earned facts. And so the ADL Center on Extremism provides that. We track a range of data points, whether or not in our heat map, which stands for hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. So whether or not it's a data set that's looking at extremist shootouts, extremist murders, terrorism plots, white supremacist propaganda, white supremacist leafleting, white supremacist events. We are taking that information and documenting it. So I encourage you all to take a moment and look in your neighborhoods, look in your cities, look in your states, and then understand the national landscape. Because these data sets help to build the larger picture of what we are seeing and what we are diligently tracking. One of those data sets includes anti-Semitic incidents. Sadly, in 2019, we have tracked that this was the highest year on record, since we've been collecting this information since 1979. And in that same year, we saw from the previous year assaults double. This includes the Poway attack or the December 2019 Jewish kosher grocery store in Jersey City, which our Vice President Greg Erie, as a special agent in charge of the Newark field office, worked with ADL when he was with the FBI to gather intelligence information and work on the grounds. And then 18 days later, we saw the attack again at Hanukkah time, where one person was killed and 4 were wounded in Muncie, New York. These are the data sets that helped us to understand the threats that face our nation today. And just to give you another sense of what we're tracking, white supremacist propaganda we have seen since 2016 increase year over year 100%. And that is true for the numbers that we're seeing as of today. In fact, in 2020, we have seen that we've surpassed already, with 3 years more to account for, we have surpassed 2019 incidents that we've collected of white supremacist propaganda that has been distributed across the country by extremists. And we're also diligently tracking, since the 1970s, domestic extremist murders. Those murders perpetrated by individuals who adhere to an extremist ideology, who translate that into violent action and fatalities. In 2019 alone, domestic extremists killed at least 42 people in the United States in 17 separate incidents. And this is the 6th deadliest year on record for domestic extremist-related killings since 1970. We found that overwhelmingly 90% of the murders carried out last year were at the hands of right-wing extremists. So it's really important for us to understand the threats and understand the nature of the landscape by collecting this data, by observing, monitoring, tracking open source and confidential information in order to pull this data set together and to paint a larger picture of what affects our nation. Also critical is being able to have tools in our toolkit in order to help explain and identify symbols, tattoos, insignias associated with various movements and ideologies. In fact, we have a database since 2000, the Hate on Display Hate Symbols Database, which has a total of 214 symbols that are associated with extremist ideology and movements, and helps law enforcement, educators, and other members of the community to track and understand the symbols. These are essentially windows into the person's ideology, into their belief system, to help us understand and tag and label the type of extremism that they embrace. And we are also looking very closely to the fact that extremists overall feel emboldened. Overall, we get that sense that extremists feel empowered to share their views. And I think the perfect case in point is if you look back at the Unite the Right rally in 2017, we saw for the first time Center on Extremism identified that this was going to be the largest white supremacist event, extremist event, that was going to recruit and attract all walks of life of extremist ideology under one big tent. And individuals who previously may have hidden in the recesses or the dark corners of the internet proudly shared their ideology and their views publicly with the world. And so we see in some ways the mainstreaming of an extremist narrative, that their messages are becoming more palatable strategically, intended to make their optics a little bit more accessible so that they can ingratiate themselves and their extremist ideology into the mainstream. We are monitoring their calls for a race war, to push back against a tyrannical order, or nihilistic beliefs that focus on destruction. We see extremists becoming emboldened in this climate, and oftentimes that mobilizes individuals to act. Add to that, the ability to weaponize technology is something that extremists have certainly been rather adept at. The ability to use a whole range of platforms to their advantage. We're not just talking about Facebook and Twitter. Today, you may have seen Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee to address the hate that proliferates on these mainstream websites. But we are seeing across the spectrum, extremists gravitate to these spaces in order to use technology for their advantage. So ADL, as Oren Siegel, our vice president, notes, ADL goes where the hate is. We go to these platforms in which these groups are operating, whether or not it's on encrypted message boards or whether or not it's on the dark web, because they are using technology to reach, to recruit, and to radicalize. Whether or not it's live streaming their hateful, murderous attacks, as we saw with Christchurch or Halle, Germany, with the whole world seeding the visualization of their action across the web. So we see their ability to weaponize technology as enormous. And this is something that we are continuously and vigilantly monitoring and trying to track. And then finally to mention that we're seeing that it doesn't just exist in this virtual space, unfortunately. It's not just neatly tied up on the web, in these chat sites, in these forums, in these communication boards. But sadly and predictably, we see that it is all too common for extremists to act on this ideology in the real world. Whether or not it's the recent arrest of base members for attacking a Michigan synagogue, or this past week, Connor Klimo, who was convicted and sentenced on weapons charges, who admitted to plotting an attack against a perceived synagogue, a gay bar, and the ADL office in Las Vegas. We see unfortunate examples of this ideology translating into the real world. And the Center on Extremism continues to be dedicated to monitoring, tracking, and helping augment law enforcement Sometimes it's proactively, where we will identify cases and individuals with criminality and we bring that to their attention. But other times we are partnering with them as part of an investigation to help augment what they're looking at, to help contextualize the ideology, the beliefs, and the influences, and the motivating factor of the alleged perpetrator. So today you're going to hear about 3 case studies in particular of ways in which ADL has worked, kind of a peek behind the scenes of how we've assisted law enforcement in a number of cases, helping whether or not it's in bringing a case to law enforcement attention, assisting on the back end, or helping to testify as an expert witness in the case to get a sentence, a conviction and sentencing. And so with that, I'd like to pass this over to my colleague, Chris, who will give you our first case study.
All right. Thank you very much, Joe. And thanks to everyone for joining us on this Never Is Now virtual session. I truly wish we could be having this session in person, to be honest. But, you know, I'd still likely be hidden behind a curtain all the same, just as I am right now. So I am the man behind the curtain. I've been an investigative researcher with the Anti-Defamation League for 15 years now, with a particular expertise in white supremacy, which includes knowing about all the sub-movements that are part of this extremist ideology, the symbols, the tattoos, numeric codes, and so on. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to briefly talk to you about some examples of our work in combating extremism, in particular in the work with law enforcement that we do. Both reactively and proactively, it's something very important. And it's going to illustrate our long-standing and highly respected working relationship with law enforcement agencies at all different levels, federal, state, and local. And it's also very pivotal, that relationship, to our fight against modern extremism. See, we have the added benefit, not being sworn law enforcement personnel, to be able to investigate individuals that we think might have the potential to pose a threat to whether it's personal property or to individual lives and so on. And so we don't have to have any kind of a criminal predicate in order for us to start looking into someone. So here's the first case that I'd like to talk about. First case is about Maurice Diggins and Maine's hate crime statute. This is going to be an opportunity for me to illustrate how we reactively work with law enforcement, because law enforcement recognizes ADL's unmatched expertise in the area of extremism. So in early 2019, the Center on Extremism was contacted by the United States Attorney's Office up in Portland, Maine, and asked if there was anybody within the agency who would be able to testify for the federal prosecution as an expert witness in the state's first ever federal hate crimes trial. The law had been on the books since 2009. It was 10 years later when they finally were able to bring one to trial, and we got the opportunity to provide expert witness testimony. They asked us to analyze tattoos of the 2 suspects that they have, because the hate crime enhancement could be upheld even greater if there was anything problematic within these tattoos that the individuals had. Now, the one is suspect who was on the individual on the left is Dusty Leo, who had tattoos, but none of them were extreme. And the second individual, though, Maurice Diggins, he in fact did have some extremist tattoos. So we were asked to look at the tattoos first and make an analysis. And then if we found anything problematic, that we would be able to testify to the meanings of those tattoos, in particular those with white supremacist explanations. So Maurice Diggins, the guy on the right, he's been charged with 2 counts of hate crimes and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with a series of unprovoked assaults against African-American men in Portland and Biddeford, Maine, back in 2018. Now, his cohort there, Dusty Leo, he faced similar charges, but decided not to go to trial and pleaded guilty to a count of conspiracy and 1 count of a hate crime. This March, it was brought to trial with Maurice Diggins, and the Center on Extremism was able to provide expert witness testimony in this first hate crimes trial at the federal level for Maine. Now, even before the trial started, in the days leading up to it, ADL's testimony was immediately called into question by the defense, saying that they made motions to try and have the judge throw out all the tattoos that Maurice Diggins had, as well as any testimony that the ADL would provide. Now, the U.S. Attorney's Office considered this such a big deal that the testimony of the ADL and the tattoos being kept in as evidence, that they even said that if the judge decides to not allow those into evidence, that they would actually file an appeals court in the U.S. Court of Appeals in the First Circuit making sure that this stuff would be brought to trial. Well, it ended up being decided that the tattoos would be admitted, and the ADL, myself in particular, was able to provide expert witness testimony about the collection of white supremacist tattoos that Maurice Diggins had. Now, many of them are very easy to identify. You can obviously see the series of the swastikas that are on there, as well as the SS lightning bolts that are on there. That's the kind of stuff that's very easily recognizable. And we were able to provide the testimony about what they meant, the origins of them, and how they've been co-opted by white supremacists currently. In addition to that, though, when ADL is asked to do such analysis, we need to look at all of the tattoos there because they might not be as obvious as the swastika or the SS. In fact, in this particular case, a very subtle WPWW, which is for White Pride Worldwide, a rallying cry of white supremacists, was concealed within other tattoos that he had on his person. The last piece of damning evidence, though, was a tattoo that he had in particular that was on his left arm. And on that left arm, he had what is known as the 14 words, tattooed inside of what's to look like an absolute vodka bottle. And this is, the 14 words is, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. It's the dominant paradigm of all white supremacists internationally. The fact that this individual got this tattooed permanently on his person speaks to the level of his commitment to a racist ideology, his white supremacist beliefs. And so when the prosecution asked the questions, I was able to provide that testimony. And when the defense attorneys, though, came back, their cross-examination basically consisted of questioning the role of the ADL, how the ADL can be an expert in this field, as well as what if he had these tattoos for so long and he no longer has the ideology. To which the response was that he had other tattoos covered up over the course of those years, but he never had any of his white supremacist tattoos covered up at all. So fortunately, it was found out that, or quickly found out that he was found guilty. And just last month, the sentence was passed that he received the maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison for his role in this hate crime. He still currently faces state charges, but he is definitely going away for at least 10 years for the federal hate crimes charge. And so that's one example of us working reactively with law enforcement, where we can help them out and they recognize our expertise. I am now going to send it back over to Jo. She is going to give an example that she assisted with. Jo, it's all you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Chris, so much for that. Now, I'm going to give you an example that sheds light on when we've provided an assist proactively. When we've come across something through our online investigations, through our tracking and monitoring. But before I do that, I want to level set a little bit. I'm going to take you back to 2018. The horrific attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 congregants were killed, 4 police officers were wounded, in addition to 2 others. On this horrific Saturday, the gunman Robert Bowers, armed with an assault rifle and several handguns, yelled, "All Jews must die," as he opened fire on the synagogue. As is the case with white supremacists, we see that after almost like a pattern, after every single attack, we see the immediate glorification of other extremists. They are lionized, they are glorified, they are celebrated for their murderous acts. They are turned into saints or heroes. And so it came as no surprise that happened when it came to Robert Bowers and his attack on the synagogue. Immediately after, we started to track a particular hashtag Hero Robert Bowers. But before I go into the case, I wanted to build up a little knowledge base so that you can understand what we came across, understand the context, the ideology, and the belief system of the virtual clues that we saw related to this case. First off, I want to explain accelerationism. White supremacists in the most extreme forms believe that Jews have injected society with deviant values. In fact, they've created this even playing field that misogyny and multiculturalism and diversity, feminism, liberalism, all of these elements have elevated everyone on an equal playing field. And as a result, they believe that society needs to be crushed because society should be rejected. It's illegitimate. And one must engage in direct action to help spiral the system down towards collapse. Now, as a core function, accelerationists hold up extremist publications like Siege or like Turner Diaries, essentially blueprints for violent action. Siege, in particular, is a collection of republished essays written in the 1980s by a former American Nazi Party member, James Mason. In it, it talks about the hatred, the desire to sow chaos and division, and ultimately culminate in destruction. Essentially, create violence as a means to an end to cause a race war. And also what we're seeing is, to kind of bring to your attention, is a typographical practice used by anti-Semites. It's called the echo. The echo is intended to indicate that the user is Jewish, or maybe the user is embracing what they believe as Jewish values of liberalism, multiculturalism. And so you'll see either the New York Times, or you'll see a Jewish leader, or someone who perhaps is perceived to be supportive of Jewish values being placed in the center of those echoes to indicate that that person, that one is in the know that they are Jewish. And so we came across the hashtag Hero Robert Bowers. And from there, that led to a deep dive of other individuals who are helping to promote and spread this hashtag to lionize and glorify the attack at Pittsburgh. From there, we came across one Facebook profile linked to someone under the name of William King. That one Facebook profile then led us to 7 other profiles, a YouTube account, and other hateful content online. And every little bit that was posted on each one of these accounts that was simultaneously maintained on a daily basis revealed images, memes, anti-Semitic content. Throughout the pages, we could identify the ideological influences, a full embrace of Hitlerian ideology, deep anti-Semitic beliefs. The individual boasted of being a member of the Klan and actually bragged with a certificate posted on his wall. He aligned himself with hate groups that advocate for an ethno-state in the Northwest. And from there, we saw violence, an embrace of attacking and harming others. In one post, we saw, "Have you read Siege?" And this was a note to others to glorify the fact that Siege was a blueprint that this particular individual, who was using various names, Tom Schill, William King, profiles 1, 2, and 3. And in it, it says, "Have you read Siege?" Essentially the prescription to crush the system and cause its collapse, embraced by these accelerationists. He'd post a British fascist banner on his wall of his bedroom, as you can see here, and he photographed himself holding an AR-15 style gun. In this particular video that we grabbed a screenshot, he planned to shoot up an expletive school. And the biggest challenge we had with this case was identifying the moments in which this individual crossed the line from exercising his First Amendment rights to criminality. Because a lot of the images that he posted, however hateful and vile and violent, frankly, they were not actionable because he didn't identify a specific target, a specific threat. He'd post images like this. "I'm here trying to, what do you need your AR-15 for?" And in it, you are looking through the barrel of a gun at a traditional scene of a bar mitzvah as a 13-year-old boy has a red dot pointed at his head, the laser from the gun. And a rhetorical question, why do you need an AR-15, is asked. In another one, we see an example of setting a bus on fire. Take back your future one synagogue at a time, with triple parentheses, echo parentheses in reverse, around 1488, which signifies for white supremacists, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, and 88, which signifies Heil Hitler, an embrace, kind of a counter to Jewish values, an embrace of neo-Nazi ideology. And in another post, we see references to trying to amass guns and ammo to kill rats. And the word rat is written in triple parentheses. And this individual had access to guns, lots and lots of guns. Coupled that with the sun and red flag, a copy of Mein Kampf, the Nazi death head, and even a certificate for his membership in this, to the Klan group in this photo. We were very concerned. So we work with law enforcement over a 3-month period, trying to figure out the moment in time when he crossed the line. And so throughout that 3-month investigation, we tagged his content. Here's just a sampling, a short sampling of some of the most egregious comments that he made online. And ultimately the guns, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in jail. All of his weapons were confiscated. And as a felon, he's prohibited from possessing guns at all. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Chris.
One last example then of a case study to illustrate the work that we do in the Center on Extremism as it pertains to working with law enforcement and combating extremism is the case of King Sheckles, who we eventually come to know as Corbin Kaufman. And what I'd like to illustrate here is really twofold. One, how we proactively work with law enforcement, as Joe just explained as well, when it comes to combating extremism, but also to show you the process of investigating someone we think merits a deeper dive into their extremism. So this case of King Sheckles is a really good example that shows, as I explain it, you're going to see how it's not always an individual in the Center on Extremism who is doing all of this. It's a team effort where we rely on the various expertises of others within the team to help work on something similar to this. And so in this particular case, many extremists who may have been active on mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook recently have been getting deplatformed when the terms of service and the community's guidelines are starting to be more enforced than they had in the past. And when that happens, that doesn't mean that the extremists that are out there are that they're going to simply kind of no longer be extremists. What they end up trying to do is either reestablish another account on those platforms, or in some particular cases, they'll actually migrate to the lesser known platforms, many of which have looser enforcements of their terms of service and sometimes no enforcement at all. In this particular case, though, what is it about somebody who calls himself King Sheckles online would catch our attention in the Center on Extremism? Well, as they start to post more and more problematic items on their various profiles. Last March, keeping in mind that this is the same time that the Christchurch massacre took place over in New Zealand by the white supremacists in the 2 mosques. It's about 6 months after Bowers went on the killing spree at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. An individual now is starting to post these types of things online. This is going to catch our attention in the Center on Extremism. He posts with his kids' refrigerator magnets about gassing the Jews and murdering African Americans. This one is captioned on the right, finger paint with your kids, and it says, murder your local Juden or your local Jew. This is going to catch our attention. Maybe we're going to start looking more into how deeply ingrained this person is within the white supremacist ideology. And as we look more and more at his profile, what might prompt us to look even further is, are they going to start posting images of weapons that they own, or weapons, or talking about weapons that they are trying to acquire or hope to acquire? And in this particular case, this King Sheckles posts on his, this by the way, is on a more obscure platform. I meant to say that earlier. This is not on Facebook or Twitter. This is on a platform called Minds, which is popular amongst a lot of right-wing extremists. And what he posts are several pictures of him with an AR-style assault rifle. And we know that's him because the tattoos on his forearm match other photos that we found on his profile. And the picture on the right became increasingly problematic. One, as I mentioned, because of the time of when this is taking place in relationship to Christ Church and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he posts the image of his hand holding the AR rifle and photoshops it over top of a congregation of Jewish men in a synagogue. That's where we start to figure we need to look into more about who this person is, trying to find clues. Can we identify who King Sheckles is? He does not put on his Mind profile what his real name is. He does not put his location of where he's located at. So as we dig deeper, it's time now to figure out, can we find who and where this person is located? This has elevated it to the level where we need to find as much information, and we think we need to share it with law enforcement. So a picture like this shows up on his profile. What he's doing with the A1 steak sauce bottle, I really don't even want to venture a guess, but that's not what's important in this picture. It's when you zoom in on the picture and you look at his bracelet here on his arm, around his wrist. That bracelet, after some more investigation, is a bracelet for a relatively obscure amusement park in central Pennsylvania called Knoebels. Now, it's not a popular park outside of more or less Pennsylvania. So right there, we think that this individual might live somewhere in the Pennsylvania area, maybe even up towards New York, if possible. But now we have it narrowed down quite possibly to a geographic area. On top of that, he then posts a picture like this. Now, this is a random picture of him posting of necklace with charms on the necklace itself. And that's not what's important in this particular case. But when you zoom in the upper left-hand corner, you will see that there's a key card up there with a barcode. And above the barcode, it says 1 Commonwealth Avenue, Lehighton, Pennsylvania. And what this ended up being is this is a community pool pass for this individual. And now we have a location for the person, Lehighton, Pennsylvania. Now, I have been to Lehighton several times in my life. It is not a very big place. It's a relatively small town in northeastern Pennsylvania. And when he posted another picture that we thought was kind of problematic, it was him doing some vandalism. He posted this photo of 2 anti-Semitic white supremacist stickers, as you can see right here, that he posted on the window of what looks to be some kind of maybe a Jewish business or something Jewish. And he writes, "Who would do such a hate crime? It's another Shoah, I'll tell you what." Well, as we're looking at this picture, we're trying to figure out where this picture was taken because he doesn't indicate anything like that. There was no metadata in the photo itself that led us to anything. But as I mentioned, I know I'm very familiar with Lehighton. And I could tell you that this picture was not taken in Lehighton. It has nothing to do with what's in the window itself back there. It has to do specifically with the reflection in the window. And as I was working with my colleague, who had another one of the investigative researchers at the time, we came to realize that this picture wasn't even taken in Pennsylvania. In fact, it was taken down in Maryland. And the reason I knew it was in Maryland was because that image of the building that's in the background is actually this building. And this building is located in Ocean City, Maryland. The reason I know this place is this is a seaside retreat condominium complex. I have stayed there in the past at this exact condominium complex. But just to verify that this is the place where he took that picture, if you go to Google Streets and you do a 180 around there and you see what's on the other side of where that condo complex is and zoom in, and there you have the Chabad Jewish Center of Ocean City, Maryland. This is the location where he put those stickers. Up until that point, a police report was filed with the Ocean City Police Department, but they had no idea who put those stickers on there. Well, there was enough evidence now. We had enough information about the crimes that he committed and his threats that he may have made that a colleague in the Center on Extremism put together a full law enforcement report on Corbin Kaufman, although we only knew him as King Sheckles at the time, and then shared it with law enforcement, but we also bring our regional office into the fold so that they're aware of it. And this is an opportunity then for the regional office, who have great relationships with law enforcement as well, to kind of be that conduit between the Center on Extremism and the law enforcement community within each respective region. Law enforcement obviously had enough information here. They did open an investigation. They secured an arrest warrant, and they ended up arresting him in April of 2014. Of 2019, and charged him with racist internet threats posted online, in particular related to that image of him holding the gun in front of the synagogue congregation. And on top of that, since they now found out that we were able to share with them that he committed that crime down in Maryland, he is facing state charges in Maryland, and he also continues to face state charges in Pennsylvania for other vandalism that he conducted in the state of Pennsylvania. His trials have not yet come up yet. They're still pending, but he is currently incarcerated and awaiting the trials themselves. So on that note, that concludes my portion there. I'm going to send it back to Joe and Greg. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in 1 second.
I will I'll tell you what, the first question that we had that came up is a very common one, and I think this will go over to Joe, but Chris or either one of us who want to take this. People are asking, how can they be more helpful online? Short of actually getting involved in the investigative phase, how can they help us? How can they help the authorities out?
Absolutely, happy to take it. One of the things that is critical to our work is that it takes a village, right? The cliche as it may be, it really takes all aspects of our community and our society to flag, see something, say something. That motto really holds true because it is that incident in your community, it is that incident at your school or in your workplace that can clue you into something. So whether or not it exists in the virtual space or in the real world, your ability to identify something that doesn't sit quite right. A former Secret Service contact of mine used to say your spidey sense, something that kind of, what sticks out that doesn't sit right with you, and helping to flag that. ADL has a way to report on our online hate incident. We encourage you to reach out. Bring it to our attention so that we can evaluate and take a look at whatever you have come across, because this is a team effort and we consider everyone in the community part of that effort.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Chris, anything to add to that?
I think I would add also, it certainly does help to make sure you're educated. Educate yourself on what's going on. As Joe had mentioned in her introduction, the resources that we put out there are not just for law enforcement. A lot of it is with law enforcement in mind, but it's also to let the community know, what are we seeing on our end when it comes to extremism? And one of the best examples I think that I like to use is when you look at our heat map and you look at the propaganda distribution throughout the various communities, part of what we have on that heat map includes examples of the propaganda that was found. Because a lot of what's out there right now does not look like your typical white supremacist propaganda. It's not necessarily a save the land, join the Klan kind of flyer. It's for our posterity, and it looks like it's an innocuous slogan, when in fact it's there might be a QR code on a sticker that leads you to a white supremacist website. So I think educating yourself is extremely important.
I agree, and thank you, Chris and Joe. We had another question come in, and I'll start with it, but please, with my colleagues. How do you work with law enforcement officers who themselves may be anti-Semitic or racist, or may intentionally disregard the information you provide them when we pass these assists along? This is obviously a complex one, and it's come up more often in the current state of the country today. As a former law enforcement officer, I firmly believe that the vast, vast majority of the 800,000 plus sworn officers really do feel like they are there to protect. Lord knows they're not doing it for the money. They're putting themselves in danger sometimes, but I am not a naive man, and understand that whenever you get a large group, there are always going to be folks who aren't of the same ethos or ideologies that we'd like them to be as protectors. And I'll look at this in two ways. When we go out as part of our Center on Extremism, when Joe and Chris and the rest of our experts go out and try to help law enforcement, again, it's that partnership, and provide them either a training or the briefings on extremism. It's like any class anybody's taken. Some people are more receptive to it, and I mean just learning from it and seeing what we're trying to teach. Most of them want to do better and want to understand, because in some cases, it's very tactical. It helps them in the street to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. What's the danger? What's going to hurt my community? So you go there for those people. But we have come across situations where people either aren't receptive, don't want to hear what we have to say when we're doing our training and we're doing our briefings. And in some cases, that's okay. However, it's not okay to harbor those feelings deep down and to act upon them. What we really feel like is by educating the whole, you're teaching their colleagues. And again, I'm a firm believer, and this is a law enforcement colleague, I don't want to work with people who are racist. I don't want to work with anti-Semitic people. I don't want to work with people who are filled with hate. And the more I can learn how to identify that, the hardest piece of that is identifying people in your own group who are, and bringing that to the attention within your department or your agency. So the educational piece helps tremendously. On the other side of this is also where what Joanna and Chris have really illustrated to you is what we call law enforcement assists. We're providing them actionable intelligence where they can go out and mitigate a threat, and in some cases make arrests or intercede as needed. We haven't run across a case where that's been ignored, where a department, because it doesn't happen to a single person in a department. We pass this information officially to a department where there's a track record of it, where it goes, and it needs to be acted upon. I'm very proud to say, and again, having seen it from both sides, we have comments from across the local, state, and federal law enforcement where they fully acknowledge and say, when the ADL sends me intelligence, we stop and we pay attention to it and we look at it because we know the background of it. We know the methodology that goes into this. We know that it's actionable, and they don't just inundate us with frivolous things. It is something they can go and they need to pay attention to. We're very proud of that. A recent magazine article also stated that the information that some of these law enforcement agencies are getting from the COE is more than they've ever received from the Department of Homeland Security. So that's the value that we bring to that. We don't run across where they will not act upon that. Plus, it's an official passage of that information, so we can track where that goes. I do want to say a sad piece of this before I ask my colleagues if they have a question, is occasionally, as you've seen in some of these law enforcement assists, we do identify law enforcement officers who are either displaying some kind of hate sign or wearing a patch on their uniform that sometimes their colleagues don't recognize. We call the balls and strikes as we see them. When we come across that, as heartbreaking as that may be, we take that as a priority and make sure that gets passed to that appropriate department, to the officials who can deal with that. And we have seen officers removed because of the information we've had to pass along. Again, it's unfortunate, but I do believe that our law enforcement partners want to make sure that those people aren't amongst them. Joanna or Chris, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that was well said. Yeah. And especially that last part I was going to mention about that if we see it with law enforcement, we don't give them a pass because of our relationship with law enforcement. We call it out as we see it. So it's extremely important.
And I would just say on the flip side, I've been doing this work for 20 years. And I say that I'm proud of ADL's relationships with law enforcement and working with law enforcement individuals who are dedicated to this mission, who've put their life on the line, and who truly want to eradicate hate and extremism in their communities. And by identifying those partners and those trusted partners, because it is a relationship that has to be developed and nurtured, I think that I'm very proud of our relationship with law enforcement on a national level.
Thank you. And to harp on that a little bit as we talk about it, and I know I keep stressing the word partnership, and I ask everybody who's listening, think about a relationship you have in your life, whether it be professional or personal, a partnership, somebody or people you've known for a long time. I would put to you that it's never smooth sailing all the way through, and the longer it goes on, it has its ups and downs. But that's what makes those bonds strong, that you're willing to call those out. And as Chris mentioned, that we're going to be harder on our partner than we are on anybody else. And I always look at my own life and challenge everybody else to. And who do you take the most important advice from? Who really has the effect on you? Is it somebody you've never met who comes up and says, I'm not too sure who you are, I've never worked with you, but I really don't like you and I think you're doing everything wrong? That's not a big impact on me. I will look in the mirror, but now if somebody I've trusted for years, who I've worked with, who I know has my back, comes and says, you're doing something wrong, you need to stop this, or we need to work on that, and I'm here to help you, let me give you some advice. That resonates. That's somebody that I can say, I know they're looking out for me, that they want my community and me to be safer. So I need to take that to heart. And if I don't, shame on me. And that's the same relationship ADL has built over the years with our law enforcement side. We have a time for a couple more questions. One that came up, and I'll start this with Chris. And as expert witnesses, how is ADL's expertise used to help in criminal cases? And I know both Chris and Joanna may have input on this.
Well, definitely our long-standing reputation precedes us. When we give our CVs to the prosecution and they see the testimonies that we have provided in particular cases, and Joanna even more than I have testified, I think it's the reputation of us being experts within our field of extremism. And we're not going to put somebody on the stand because they're part of the Center on Extremism if they don't have an expertise in that particular field. So if we have somebody who's a Black separatist expert, they're not going to necessarily testify when it comes to white supremacy. We have a pretty decent menu within our bandwidth in the Center on Extremism of people with various expertises.
And I would just like to add, I think what's critical is that oftentimes the jury doesn't have the level of knowledge to evaluate the facts of the case, because we're looking at groups that are defined by a very complex subculture in some ways, a value system or devoid of value system, indicators and symbols that all have great meaning. And so as expert witnesses, we're able to help identify and explain the things that may seem foreign to the jury to help them understand the facts of the case a little bit better, to contextualize it beyond the criminal proceedings into a larger landscape. And so whether or not it's testifying in double homicides or in a sovereign citizen case or a hate crimes case, a lot of times the ideological motivation is a really key part of the case, and understanding that and the backdrop helps the jury and the court understand the case even better.
Thank you, Joe and Chris. And we have time for a couple more. One that I'll start out with is what can be done about incidents that do not rise to a level that would involve law enforcement, i.e. harassment in neighborhoods, posting hate symbols. It's an excellent question, and we're focusing here on our relationship with law enforcement, but we also, as the ADL, have relationships with other like-minded agencies and also the community leaders. It strikes me as very recently, earlier this week, the FBI released the hate crime statistics for 2019, which are grossly underreported. It's something the ADL is trying to work with our legislative side to get more of this reporting so we can accurately diagnose where these areas are. If you see something that doesn't rise to the level of a crime and you try to report it to the police, our relationships either with law enforcement or with you, please report it to the ADL. We have other assets too. We can go to those communities, and if we see something that not rising to a criminal level, in some ways that's a good thing. Maybe we can plug in our educational piece with those community leaders and bridge those gaps. And if we're seeing it, for instance, around a school and people scrawling and graffitiing hate symbols on that wall, we can deal with the school administrators and provide education on what extremism is and how horrific it is and what it can lead to. And again, it goes back on one of the questions that came out earlier. Sometimes you can't save everyone in that school or teach them that this is wrong, but you'd be surprised how many people you can reach. And when they understand the basis for what they're doing, you'd be surprised what an effect it can have. So please don't just let that go by. Report to somebody, a community leader, the ADL, law enforcement. We like to think of it as a team, that if I can't deal with it or it's not within my portfolio or mandate, I'll find somebody who's is, that they can help you with this. So again, it makes everybody safer. Nobody needs anything to escalate. And when we start to see these signs early, if we can nip that, it probably will prevent something more horrific from happening. I'm going to go right into the other question, which is a very interesting one, and Chris and then Joe on this one. What is the role women have in training young people in extremist movements?
Well, depending on which sub-movement of white supremacy it is, women have various roles. For example, when you have right-wing extremists who proclaim themselves to be proud Western chauvinists, you can imagine how they feel about women. But oddly enough, there are some women who do belong to those groups within that branch of right-wing extremism. You do have others, though, that play more of a leadership role. There are certain white supremacist prison gangs out there who have women playing a prominent role within the prison gang itself. Could be anything from like as drug mules or anything of the sort. So they certainly have a role within the movement. But as far as training the young people to get into the movement, there's really no rhyme or reason as to which sub-movements of white supremacy have more women playing a more aggressive role in training the youth. I think I'm going to go back and echo what Joe said earlier. the weaponization of technology by the extremists and using these various platforms, and you think about how connected the youth is to the various platforms, that just becomes the easier tool to train and recruit these individuals rather than a mom or a dad or somebody like that. Now, certainly the real people in their lives will have an effect, but I think the online spheres that are out there with the extremists, where they're out there, that's going to have an even greater impact.
Thanks, Chris. And we have our final question before we wrap, and I want to thank everybody for sending these in. This is an important one, and this will start with Joe. Do you, the ADL, do we work with formers or those individuals who have left the neo-Nazi organizations?
I think the best way to answer it is to understand ADL motto, right? That if hate can be learned, hate can be unlearned. And that is critical, because otherwise we will continue down that pathway that no one is redeemable. And I think with that in mind, working with those who have had a change of course, who have seen the light or have looked at where hate has led them and reevaluated their decisions, can be a very, very significant story to elevate. Understanding someone's kind of redirect in terms of their spiraling of hate is significant. So I think those stories and understanding that there are other pathways, that one is not embedded in a bigotry and racism forever, and that there is a potential for change is important. And so we must continue to do this work, whether or not it's through education with our young people, which is critical, because we're focused on the dark side in this conversation today. But really the antidote to hate is through education, is through transforming hearts and minds and having our leaders of tomorrow be able to affect that type of change. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And Joe and Chris, thank you so much. Oh, Chris, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying I could not have said it better, Joe.
Bravo. Go team.
Well, thank you both. As you can see, this as well as, and I echo what Joe just said, this is dark work. But what makes it a little easier is you work with such professional and expert colleagues as Joanna and Chris. So thank you both for being on this panel. Thank you so much for having us today, and I hope the rest of your afternoon is fine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.